December 1945. U.S. Army Hospital, Heidelberg, Germany. The war is over. America has won. But General George S. Patton is fighting his last battle, flat on his back. Dwight D. Eisenhower enters the room, the supreme commander of Allied forces, the man who led America to victory in Europe. There are no cameras, no uniforms on display, just silence. Patton speaks first. Not about medals, not about glory. He talks about orders that slowed American advances, about moments when U.S. armor could have kept rolling, but didn't, about victories that, in his mind, were left unfinished. Eisenhower does not correct him. He listens. Years later, Eisenhower would quietly admit that Patton was right, about more than he was wrong, that America needed Patton's aggression, even when it frightened allies and embarrassed Washington. But in 1945, Eisenhower could not say that, not while Patton lived, not while the war's politics still mattered. Patton would die days later. Eisenhower would carry the truth for years. And only after Patton was gone did Eisenhower finally allow himself to admit what America had almost lost. To understand why Eisenhower stayed silent while Patton lived, you have to return to the moment their paths became inseparable, before America ever set foot in occupied Europe. In 1942, the United States Army was still untested against Germany. Its generals were learning modern war in real time. Dwight D. Eisenhower rose not because he was the most aggressive commander, but because he could manage people, Britons, Americans, politicians, and egos, without letting the alliance fracture. Washington trusted him to keep the coalition together. George S. Patton was the opposite. Patton believed war was movement, speed, relentless pressure. He spoke in absolutes and profanity. He inspired fear as much as loyalty. Eisenhower recognized Patton's talent early, his understanding of armored warfare, his instinct for attack, but he also saw the danger, not to the enemy but to Allied unity. North Africa proved both men right. Patton took over the WWII Corps after disaster at Kasserine Pass in 1943. He restored discipline overnight. German officers noticed immediately. So did Eisenhower. Patton's methods worked, but his mouth worked faster. Incidents followed, public outbursts, political recklessness, and eventually the Sicily slapping incidents that nearly ended his career. Eisenhower faced a calculation that would define the war. Remove Patton and lose one of America's sharpest weapons. Keep him and risk public outrage and Allied instability. Eisenhower chose control. Patton was sidelined, then quietly protected, never fully unleashed, never fully dismissed. Eisenhower shielded him from court-martial, but also kept him under a tighter leash than any other senior commander. It was not punishment, it was containment. And that pattern would repeat itself, again and again. As the war grew larger, the stakes higher, and Patton's battlefield value became impossible to ignore. By the time the Allies prepared for the invasion of Western Europe, Eisenhower knew exactly what Patton could do. The question was whether he could afford to let him do it. By 1944, the war in Europe had become a balancing act, not just of armies but of personalities. Eisenhower was now supreme commander of Allied expeditionary forces, responsible not only for defeating Germany, but for holding together a fragile coalition. British pride, American ambition, political pressure from Washington, and constant scrutiny from London all converged on his desk. Patton stood at the center of that storm. The invasion of Normandy required deception as much as force. Eisenhower used Patton's reputation deliberately, placing him in command of a phantom army, 1st U.S. Army Group, to convince the Germans that the main landing would strike at Pas-de-Calais. German intelligence believed Patton was America's best offensive commander. They waited for him, and in doing so, they misread the battlefield. Patton's absence from D-Day was not accidental, it was calculated. When Patton finally entered the fight in July 1944, commanding Third Army, the results were immediate. His forces broke out of Normandy, raced across France, and destroyed German formations faster than Allied planners had predicted. His advances embarrassed cautious commanders and alarmed Allied politicians. Eisenhower watched carefully. Every mile Patton gained created opportunity and risk. British commanders, particularly Bernard Montgomery, worried that Patton's pace undermined coordinated strategy. American leaders worried about civilian casualties, headlines, and diplomatic fallout. Eisenhower's role was no longer just to win, it was to control how victory unfolded. And so the pattern continued. Patton was unleashed just enough to break stalemates, then restrained before his momentum disrupted the alliance. During the Battle of the Bulge, Eisenhower turned to Patton again, trusting him to pivot an entire army north in winter conditions. Patton delivered, rapidly, decisively. Afterward, the leash returned. By war's end, Patton felt sidelined. Eisenhower felt exhausted. Both men knew the truth neither could say openly. The war had been won by coalition politics as much as battlefield brilliance. That truth would hang between them long after the guns fell silent, waiting for a moment when it could finally be spoken. December 9, 1945. Patton is traveling through Germany on his way back to the United States, a routine journey. But fate intervenes, a car accident that would end the life of one of America's most famous generals. He survives the initial crash, but his injuries are severe. Hospitalized in Heidelberg, Patton is conscious, aware, and for the first time in months, free to speak without military restraints. He calls for Eisenhower, not in anger, not in complaint, but to share what he has carried through the campaigns of Europe. Patton speaks of frustration, of being restrained when speed and aggression could have crushed the German forces faster, of victories delayed by political caution, alliances, and diplomatic fear. He confesses regret, not for the battles he led, but for the moments he was held back. Eisenhower listens. No orders are issued. No public statements are made. Nothing will ever appear in the newspapers. But in this room, the private truth becomes undeniable. Patton had been both indispensable and constrained by Eisenhower's careful strategy. The conversation lasts hours. Patton's voice weakens, but his clarity is sharp. He articulates what no other general would dare, how the war might have ended faster, how American power could have been demonstrated more decisively, how his own instincts, when restrained, became both a strategic gain and a personal frustration. Eisenhower does not reply immediately. He nods, asks questions, takes notes in his mind. There is no public acknowledgement, only understanding. Only the quiet realization that the war, and history itself, had been shaped by the tension between these two men. Patton's condition worsens. Doctors work tirelessly, but he cannot recover. Days later, the man who had raced across Europe with tanks and courage is gone. And only now, in the aftermath of Patton's death, does Eisenhower begin to speak privately. Letters, memoirs, and personal accounts that hint at what he had long recognized. That America had been fortunate to have a general like Patton, even if his brilliance had been a dangerous, untamed force. The day Patton died, December 21, 1945, Eisenhower received the news quietly, without ceremony. There were no parades, no headlines, only the calculated acknowledgement of loss and responsibility. For Eisenhower, the moment carried more than grief. It carried clarity. In the weeks that followed, he confided in close aides and began writing private reflections that would never see publication in his lifetime. For the first time, Eisenhower admitted, without equivocation, that Patton had been right about many things. The need for speed in maneuver warfare, the value of audacious action, and the risks inherent in overly cautious strategy. He acknowledged that Patton's dangerous temperament had been an asset, not a liability, when channeled correctly. These admissions were not meant for public consumption. Eisenhower understood the optics of praise for Patton. To many in Washington and London, Patton had been reckless. To Eisenhower, he had been essential. In letters to close confidants, he wrote of Patton as the one commander whose initiative and courage could have ended the war sooner, if only politics and caution had allowed it. Historians later confirmed this perspective in declassified documents and interviews with Eisenhower's aides. Behind the calm, measured exterior, Eisenhower had always recognized that Patton's battlefield brilliance had been unmatched, but it required careful containment to prevent chaos. Only in Patton's absence could Eisenhower finally acknowledge the full truth without risking controversy or fracturing the fragile post-war alliance. In these private admissions, Eisenhower did not embellish. He did not dramatize. He described plainly the tension between necessity and restraint, the central dilemma of leadership. Patton's death removed the constraint of diplomacy. It allowed Eisenhower to reconcile admiration, regret, and the sober realization that America had benefited from a dangerous brilliance it had barely contained. And with that, the story of their intertwined legacies, the restrained genius and the untamed force, entered a new chapter, one that would shape history's view of Patton and cement Eisenhower's reputation as the man who won a war while managing the most unpredictable general the U.S. had ever produced. Patton's death sent shockwaves through the military and political world. Newspapers across the United States called him a hero, a symbol of American daring and armored warfare genius. Headlines immortalized his victories in Europe, Normandy, the breakout across France, the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. But few captured the complexity of the man behind the medals, or the tension that had defined his relationship with Eisenhower. Eisenhower, meanwhile, faced a different reality. Publicly, he maintained composure. He issued measured statements honoring Patton's service, praising his courage, and expressing condolences to the family. Privately, he began writing letters, notes, and reflections that historians would later uncover, revealing a depth of acknowledgment and restrained admiration he could never voice while Patton lived. He described Patton as a man of unmatched brilliance, whose boldness was both a gift and a challenge, words carefully balanced to avoid controversy while capturing his private assessment. The immediate aftermath also involved military politics. Patton had been a lightning rod for criticism, his rapid advances and outspoken nature threatening Allied cohesion. Eisenhower's leadership had relied on containing that force without breaking it. With Patton gone, the Allies lost not only a bold strategist, but also a personal challenge to Eisenhower's command style. A constant reminder that victory had required more than just careful planning. It had demanded courage and audacity harnessed with restraint. For the American public, Patton became a legend. Films, memoirs, and articles lionized his exploits, but few understood the silent hand that had both restrained and protected him: Eisenhower's strategic discretion. Behind the spectacle of tanks racing across Europe was the quiet orchestration of a commander who had to balance talent, temperament, and politics. Historians later noted that Eisenhower's private confessions after Patton's death reframed the narrative of the European campaign. Where once Patton had been seen as reckless, Eisenhower's letters and interviews revealed a more nuanced truth, that the general's audacity had been necessary to victory, and that restraint, not negligence, had been Eisenhower's careful response. As Europe settled into peace and the shadow of war began to fade, Eisenhower carried this understanding quietly. Patton's absence freed him to speak, to acknowledge, and to document what had been impossible to voice during the chaos of conflict. The nation would remember Patton's victories, but only Eisenhower truly understood how those victories were shaped and contained. History remembers Patton for audacity and Eisenhower for restraint, but their legacy reveals something deeper. Victory came from the delicate balance between bold action and careful strategy. Only after Patton's death could Eisenhower acknowledge the truth he had long carried, that Patton's brilliance had been indispensable, yet needed guidance to avoid chaos. Their intertwined story reminds us that greatness in war is not just courage or command alone, but the quiet understanding of when to unleash it and when to hold it back.